Hey, it's Dr. DeCubellis here. We're at Main Street Chiropractic today, and today we're talking with Phil, who is the owner and founder of Sandhill Coffee. So thanks for being here today.
No, thank you, doctor. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So I want to kind of go into a little bit of detail about this, but first let's kind of start at the beginning. Like, what made you interested in even starting this company?
So probably not the most traditional route for starting a coffee business. Prior to starting Sandhill Coffee, I had never worked in a cafe, never served a cup of coffee in a restaurant anywhere. I actually used to work in the pharmaceutical world in Michigan. So I used to live in Michigan, moved to Chicago when we found out my wife and I were expecting our first. And it was actually at the cafe of the hospital, I guess, where the light bulb went off. Um, Running on limited sleep the first few days of a newborn. I was always running down to the cafe and trying different coffees. And when I noticed a flavor difference between one country versus another country, a light bulb went off. And, I thought that was very interesting. So from that point, I bought a history book on coffee, which, history book, really thrilling read, right?
Right.
But it really piqued my interest because I didn't know so many things of the coffee world. And in the grand scheme of things, coffee's, like the history of coffee is probably like 400 years old. I mean, it goes back more, but the expansion is only like 400 or 500 years. So then from that point, I actually started roasting my own coffee for myself while still looking for a job. No job offers were flying in. So after a little bit of time, I thought, why not give this a try?
Right.
And here we are almost 4 years later.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Sometimes the best, innovation is built out of adversity like that. And similar type story with me and my clinic. So it's always interesting to hear that. And especially because it was like you went from a totally different background. So with that, how much do you think, like, did any of that background in the pharmaceutical help you at all? Maybe not through the knowledge, maybe just knowing how to do connections or talk to people. Did any of that come in handy, or was it just a totally different thing?
No, so I guess ultimately, I still get my science fix a little bit from
Right.
the roasting process, because I do all the roasting as well. So I still get my science fix from the roasting process, the brewing process. I mean, because if you're like really focused on that, it's a lot of chemistry. So it kind of brings you back to high school and college, all the chemistry stuff. So it's kind of fun. But other than that, it's making connections with people ultimately, whether that be, it's a bigger world because, I'm reaching out to people in different countries, talking to people in different countries about coffee and things. So, but it's ultimately just about connecting with people.
That sounds interesting. Yeah, definitely. Now tell me a little bit about your specific coffee. Like, what is different about this?
Yeah, so one thing out of all the coffees I have, one thing I'm really focusing on is buying direct from the farm, because I want you, the consumer, to know where your coffee's coming from. So the short process of that is it's grown on the farm, comes to me, I roast it, right to you. So it cuts out a lot of the steps that may have happened in the past. And by doing that, I could possibly be getting coffee from smaller farms, more unique things. For example, I have a coffee from Nicaragua. If you look online, it's the name, I put the name right on the bag itself. That's because all the coffee comes from one person's farm. So it's essentially like the coffee field in his backyard is where all the coffee's coming from.
Interesting. That's really nice. Now, talk to me. You mentioned before, you said that when you were trying that coffee, you noticed that, like, there was different flavors based on where it comes from. Like, what are we talking about when you say like different taste? Are we talking about different amounts of like caffeine or strength, boldness? Like, I'm not a coffee connoisseur, so can I go into a little bit of detail with that?
Sure. Do you drink wine or beer?
Yes.
So the easiest comparison is that.
Okay.
So think of wine, for example. You have wine from France, Italy, California, northern Michigan. They may all be, let's say, we're going to keep it general, a red wine. It may fall in the category of being a red wine, but there's subtle differences in those depending on which country they're at, which country they're grown in, sorry. So the elevation they're grown in, the weather that year can have an effect on the flavor. So those are some of the differences as well. And then a big difference is when it gets to me, the roaster, is how I handle that. So am I doing a light roast, a dark roast, a medium roast, somewhere in between, kind of alter and bring out what flavors I want to show in that cup of coffee.
Okay. Now let me ask you this: when it comes to coffee, let's say everything is the same, meaning like you're taking coffee from the same batch that you've made. When you're talking about taking those coffee and you're making it, is there a difference in taste between whether you cold brew it or you do like a hot brew, or does that change any of the flavor, aroma, or anything with the coffee?
It does.
Okay.
Yep. So cold brew, what you're doing is you're letting the coffee grounds steep overnight, and any brew method where you're using hot water, so espresso, pour over, your standard drip maker, you're going to get subtle differences within each. So for example, like it depends, a lot have to do on the filter as well. So the filter that you're using, so like your standard drip maker filter versus a pour over filter, or your French press, which doesn't use a filter. So yeah, there will be subtle differences.
Okay.
In
Now,
each brew method.
Now with those different ones, because there's differences, does one, I should say, I guess, last longer? Meaning, like once it's brewed, it'll still have the same flavor for longer than another. Like, does one not last as long? Like you see those places to where people will keep if they brew the coffee, they keep it on a burner or on warm all day.
Oh yeah.
That's probably not the best for the coffee, I'm assuming, correct?
Not ideal.
Okay. So like if you cold brew, does cold brew stay longer because it's closer to that room temperature than warm, or does that have nothing to do with it?
So you are going to notice different flavors. So like for example, say your hot pot of coffee, it's done brewing, you try a cup, you'll notice some the flavors that you enjoy, because that's why you buy that coffee and you brew it. Let that same cup of coffee sit on your counter. You get distracted at home, work, kids, things happen. You come back half hour later, it's cooled down. It's going to taste slightly different, and that's just the kind of like the chemistry behind it, and what is kind of like what flavors are remaining when that liquid cools.
Okay, and I guess that makes sense. It's going through that change chemically. So with that in mind, I know another big thing that kind of goes with coffee is what you put in it. So
Yes.
There's some people who will drink black coffee, some people. What do you prefer, being like the coffee guy? What's your preference?
So personal preference, I'll approach that two ways.
Yeah.
Personal and what I always suggest to people. So personal preference, I don't add anything anymore. I'll admit, prior to doing this, I was a cream and sugar guy. But the more I've started roasting my own and more I've started doing this for people, I drink it black, so I appreciate the subtleties that one coffee may have versus another. Now, as far as what I tell other people, I always just say, hey, try it black first so you can notice some difference. If you don't like it, do whatever you do. Add your cream, sugar. I'm not here to tell you how to make your cup of coffee.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the other thing too is you also have some different mugs. Now, let me ask you this: we see different sizes and shapes of mugs, does that have any effect except for just keeping it warmer longer, or does that have something to do with keeping the flavor longer too?
Oh, that's a good question that I'll admit I don't know.
Okay.
My first guess would just be it'd have to do with keeping the temperature, like like a Yeti or something that's insulated. It's just going to keep the temperature longer, so you're having that hot cup of coffee longer. Yeah, otherwise, that's good. I think you stumped me on that one.
There we go. First time. Now, when you are brewing, so let me ask you this too. So let's say you're brewing for yourself, right? But you know you want to have more than one cup.
Yep.
Is it advised to just brew one cup at a time, or brew a larger amount and have it there? That way you can go back.
I would say it depends on your brew method.
Okay.
So if you're using a pot of coffee, it's just way easier to brew a line up or two lines up on that pot marker, so you have it ready. If you're, let's say for pour over, for example, that's my favorite, because my wife's not the biggest coffee drinker. So whenever I'm brewing coffee, I'm brewing one cup at a time for myself.
Right.
So for something like that, I'll brew one cup, and if I want another one, I'll just go brew another one. So I guess it's totally dependent on what fits best in your schedule.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, when we talk about the different kinds of roasts, you mentioned a little bit earlier, there's light, medium, dark. Is it only about the flavor, or is there a change in like caffeine as well in those different kind of roasts?
flavor is a huge impact on that. So the analogy that I always use is think of cooking meat, so your fish, steaks. So the time and temperature play a large impact. So steaks, for example, think of rare as a light roast. Think of well done as a dark roast. So when you're cooking a well done steak, you're cooking it longer. Same thing with roasting.
Interesting. Okay.
And now to answer your caffeine question, so here, if you ever want to win a fun bet with friends or stuff, there is actually more caffeine in a lighter roast, technically. And I say technically because the difference is very small, but it's still technically true.
Interesting. That is the exact opposite of what you would normally think.
Right.
You know, you think the darker, more interesting.
So this might get a little to chemistry class. But so what's actually happening for the darker roast is when you're roasting it darker, the natural sugars and the kind of like the natural acidity that's in there is changing. And the dark roast hits your tongue quicker. So that's why it feels like some dark roast like really just like punch your tongue. It's because of what's changed in the chemistry behind the coffee bean.
Interesting. All right, let me ask you this. When brewing coffee, does it make any difference in the type of water you use? Whether it's like, you know, unfiltered water, tap water, you know, is there like a preferred method to make sure you keep the most flavor, or does it not necessarily matter?
Oh, good question. And yes, water plays a huge impact. Because I think, here's a percentage, I think like coffee makes up only like 3% of your cup. So it's mainly water. So using filtered water is ideal. One, it's whatever you're brewing with is going to last longer, so that you're not going to get any buildup, and it's just going to be a better tasting cup of coffee.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I think one thing too, and this is just me thinking about people in general. I think one thing that people also kind of make a mistake with coffee is making sure their actual brewing method is clean. And is cleaned regularly. You know, the more intricate of a brewing method they have, the more things to clean and more things to go wrong, you know. But that's definitely going to impact the flavor if they've got filth or it's just not as clean as it should be.
Right. No, definitely.
And then two, when you have, so when we talk about the different roasts, like the light, the medium, and the dark, it's all coming from the same like coffee bean then?
Correct. So you can take the same coffee bean, roast at a light roast that, you know, take another batch, roast at a dark roast.
Interesting. Okay.
Just like how you would take the same steak and like you're cooking at a family outing. You know, oh, you want a medium rare, you want a medium, this person wants a well done. It's that same steak essentially, but just cooked different ways.
That's so interesting. And it's a different way to think. I mean, it makes total sense. But when you just see it on the shelf and it's, you know, already pre-cooked, so to speak,
right.
You know, you don't necessarily think about that. Now, if we go back and we talk about, you know, you're selecting the type of coffee beans you want to make the quality of coffee that you have, how long does it take from the time those plants are planted to where they can get a harvest to where then once the harvest is, then you can get it in? How long does that like timeline last? Oh,
yeah, definitely. So for, let's say a coffee plant is planted in 2020, for example, it's not going to be a adult, so to speak, and producing coffee cherries to sell for 4 years. So the first 4 years of that coffee plant's life, it's being taken care of actually like in a plant nursery. But they let it grow and then move it up to the field so it can be exposed to the environmental stressors. And then when it starts producing coffee cherries, they're actually called, for the first 3 years, the cherries are picked and either discarded right on the ground to use as fertilizer, or just taken away to use in a different field as fertilizer. So those first few years, the coffee cherries, are just discarded. And then year 4, usually, is when they start being harvested for us to, you know, end result for us to drink. So Central America, the harvest season is generally between November, say early February, that kind of window. So as soon as everything is harvested, then it goes to get processed, and from processing, it gets bagged, shipped, and it usually arrives, we'll say here in the Midwest to me, by like June. So a little over 6 months, start to finish.
Interesting. Now, and once they harvest those coffee cherries, like how long do they last before they need to be made into like a specific like your coffee? Like how long is the window before like it has to be processed?
So it depends on which way it's being processed. So as soon as coffee's harvested, it has to be, the processing has to start that day, because you don't want the fruit essentially to go bad. You don't want it to rot. So there's 3 different main ways that coffee is processed. Washed processing, which is kind of the standard. Like if you don't see any special notice about it, odds are it's washed. Honey, and no honey is actually used.
Okay.
And natural. So washed, what happens is the bean that we're used to seeing and talking about is essentially the seed from the coffee cherry. As soon as it's harvested from the field, it's brought down, and that seed, the bean, is separated from the cherry. As soon as it's separated, it gets washed. So here's where the wash name comes from. To remove any of just like the fruit, it's called mucilage, but it's just like that fruity, sugary substance that's around the seed. From that point, it goes to dry. And then during the drying phase, it could be a week, 2 weeks, depends on the weather.
Okay.
And then that's the wash. So for the honey, it's a very similar process, but as soon as that seed is removed from the cherry, you don't wash off the mucilage, the fruity, sticky part. You just let it air dry. And natural is where you take the coffee cherry down from the field and just leave it in the cherry, just let it air dry.
Interesting. And that has, I'm assuming, a difference in flavor as well?
It does. So the natural, so I currently have one natural that I offer, and it has a very like fruity, sweet, natural taste. So you don't have to add anything to the coffee, and you get this really nice sweetness from it.
Interesting. It sounds very good, actually. Now, another thing that I've never actually really looked at, I think one reason is when you buy coffee, you don't expect to not drink it, after a long period of time. Like you're buying to drink it.
Mm-hmm.
Does this coffee have a shelf life? Because I don't think anyone ever really gets to the point to where that would ever come into play, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think so. If you're going to go to a grocery store and buy it, most people are going to say there's a 1-year shelf life. And that's with, if the bag is flushed with CO2, nitrogen flushed. So that gives it a longer shelf life. But as far as freshness, so let's say, the bag was flushed with nitrogen, sat on the shelf for a while, and you buy it. You take it home, you open it up, it's going to smell like it's freshly roasted. But within a week, it's going to taste like year-old coffee.
Wow.
So it quickly degrades. So if you bought like a bag that was roasted within a week, and you ground up half of it, brewed half of it, waited a few weeks to try it again, you'll notice a little difference.
Okay.
I mean, it's not gonna be enough where you're gonna throw the bag away,
Right.
But there's gonna be a subtle difference.
Okay, that makes sense. So tell me a little bit about like different like kinds of coffee you have.
Yeah, definitely. So at the moment, I have coffee from Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, Papua New Guinea, and Colombia.
Okay.
And so each of those countries I roast differently. So you're going to get little uniqueness from each one.
Okay. And now within there, is there certain areas that you go more light versus dark, or how does that work?
So when I get a coffee, and kind of like the way I looked at it, and this is, I could be breaking some coffee rules. I don't know. It was just what I've done since I started. I look at what I offer as like a menu. So I have a light roast with certain flavors in between a light and medium, dark. So when I run out of one or want to replace one, I try to find something that fits that kind of roast level, because people have different roast level preferences. So as far as flavor goes, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring out the best in that coffee bean. So if this coffee bean is a unique coffee bean with some really nice flavor, I'm going to roast that like medium or lighter to kind of bring out really like kind of show off those nuances. Whereas like a dark roast, you can get a dark roast, let's say from Colombia and Guatemala, if you roast it dark, it's going to be fairly similar. There's going to be some subtle differences, but kind of a dark roast kind of generally always has those like smoky, chocolatey kind of flavors.
Okay, interesting. Well, it's nice too. I mean, there's just such a variety. Is there one like is there one that's more for like coffee connoisseurs, like who know what they like and more beginning, or is it really just 100% up to your flavor, like what you think tastes good?
I think it's totally up to you.
Okay.
I've learned it's totally subjective. I got a really good story from, excuse me, from my first year at a farmer's market. I was super amped up, super excited to like have people try the coffee I roasted. And I remember, because at that time I was able to offer samples, pre-COVID. And one person walked up, tried it, was like, wow, this is delicious. I'll take a bag. Very next person in line wanted to try it. And like you could just see as soon as they sipped it, they're like, no, not for me, no thanks, and walked away. So kind of that was like a harsh reality of, it's very subjective.
Yeah.
And so what I always suggest to people is just keep trying until you find something you like, just like beer and wine.
Yeah.
If if you really like dark roast and you always buy a Colombian dark roast, try Guatemalan dark roast. Just experiment a little bit, kind of expand your horizons a little bit. Maybe just try different countries.
That makes sense. Now, if someone wanted to buy some coffee, how can they go about doing that?
The easiest way would be on our website, so sandhillcoffee.com, or if you catch us at a local market.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'll put the link down here so everyone can,
awesome.
can see
Appreciate
that. We talked a lot. I think you gave a lot of good information just on the background of coffee, which I didn't know any of that stuff. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
And on the business, was there anything we didn't talk about that you'd want to mention?
Well, this goes into like the history of it. So here's a kind of a fun thing about coffee. You can totally use this to win some bets against your friends if you're arguing over beers or anything. Do you know where coffee originated? So like the legend behind coffee.
No idea.
So it actually originated in the southwest kingdom of Ethiopia in a region of Kefa, K-E-F-A. And the legend has it is that a goat herder was out one day watching his goats. It was a nice sunny day, so he leaned up against a tree, dozed off, taking a nap. Woke up, looking around, couldn't see his goats anywhere. So he starts running around trying to find them. After a few minutes goes by, he finally stumbles across them, and they are jumping over bushes, running around, chasing each other. And he's like, well, what did they get into? Why did they have so much energy? So he follows them around to watch what they're eating, and they're eating these berries, the coffee berries.
Interesting.
So supposedly that's how it all started.
We've never guessed that. So it's all thanks to goats.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming out here. Again, you guys visit the website. You can get coffee there, a couple different varieties as well. And Phil, thanks for being here at Sandhill Coffee. And it's a local coffee as well, so definitely visit the website. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
No problem.